Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to the quiet crossroads of fever and empire, where unseen wings once guided the map of the world. Picture warm air above a still marsh, the faint ripple of water under moonlight, and the slow hum of life shaped by something too small to see. So before the silence of night surrounds you, take a moment to like and subscribe. Just if this brought you peace of mind, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. It is a strange thing to imagine that one of the most powerful forces in human history is something you can't see. Not a king, or an army, or a natural disaster, just a microscopic parasite, quietly slipping from one body to another. For much of recorded history, malaria was the slow, invisible hand that shaped where empires rose, where they fell, and how people lived, died, and migrated. And though today it feels like a problem mostly belonging to textbooks and faraway tropics, for centuries it was the quiet background hum of civilization itself. The ancient Greeks knew it well. Though they didn't call it malaria, they just noticed that summer brought fevers, and that the fevers often clustered near marshes. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, wrote about it almost 2,400 years ago. He described the characteristic cycle of chills and heat, the way it seemed to come and go in regular intervals. He didn't have a microscope, of course, so he thought it had something to do with bad air, miasma, the invisible stench of decay. The name malaria literally means bad air in Italian. The idea stuck for centuries, because honestly, it made sense at the time. The smell of swamp gas and dead seemed like a plausible cause when you had nothing else to go on. It's not as though ancient people were oblivious. They noticed patterns. Greek farmers drained swamps, not just for agriculture, but because they figured healthier land meant fewer fevers. Roman engineers went even further. They built aqueducts, drained marshes, and stationed troops away from lowlands whenever possible. But Rome was, unfortunately, surrounded by rivers and marshy plains. The Tiber Valley was a mosquito's paradise, so even as the Romans conquered most of Europe, Africa, and the Near East, their soldiers were constantly at war with a quieter enemy. Some modern historians believe that malaria helped shape the very limits of Roman expansion. The empire's reach tended to falter where the environment favored anopheles, mosquitoes. Armies weakened by fevers were no match for local populations already hardened to the disease. Even emperors weren't spared. Augustus, the great founder of the imperial dynasty, was said to have suffered from recurrent bouts of fever throughout his life. Ancient physicians described him as frail and often exhausted. We can't confirm whether it was malaria, but the symptoms line up neatly enough to make the case. Over time, the disease insinuated itself into the rhythms of Roman life. It was something expected, endured, and quietly feared. Roman writers like Horace and Livy mentioned marsh fevers, the way we might mention allergy season or flu season. Annoying, sometimes deadly, but just part of existence. The Romans even associated certain gods and spirits with fever. The goddess Febris, for example, was invoked to protect people from it. Her temples were tucked away near the edges of the city, close to the unhealthy zones. There's something faintly poetic about that. Shrines to a fever god set right where the mosquitoes lived. When the empire finally began to crumble in the west, the disease didn't go anywhere. In fact, malaria outlasted Rome itself. As trade slowed and infrastructure decayed, marshlands returned, and the mosquitoes had an easier time. Entire stretches of Italy became malarial backwaters for centuries afterward. The Roman Campania, once the fertile heartland of Italy, turned into a nearly uninhabitable plain. Even during the Renaissance, popes and cardinals built their villas up in the hills of Tivoli to escape the bad air below. The irony of malaria's long history is that, for much of it, no one realized it involved parasites at all. The connection to mosquitoes only came very late, thousands of years after people had already written about the fevers. But before that discovery, humans waged war against the illness using what they could. Sometimes that meant draining wetlands. Sometimes it meant burning aromatic herbs. Sometimes it meant building entire cities on higher ground just to avoid the miasma. The disease shaped cultures far beyond Europe. In Africa, malaria's story was even deeper. There, humans and the parasite evolved together. The Plasmodium falciparum species, the most lethal form, was native to sub-Saharan Africa. Over countless generations, certain populations developed partial genetic resistance. One of the better-known examples is the sickle cell trait, which offers protection against malaria at the cost of other health complications. It's a grim kind of trade-off, a gene that helps people survive fevers, but can cause suffering in its own right. This biological tug-of-war went on quietly for millennia. Malaria didn't just follow humans, it helped shape us. The distribution of the disease influenced where settlements thrived, where people farmed, even which crops were favored. In Africa and parts of Asia, it became part of the background of life, like the rhythm of the seasons. In Europe, where the climate was cooler, malaria ebbed and flowed depending on temperature and marsh conditions, often striking hardest in the warmer months. By the Middle Ages, Europeans had grown used to recurring fevers in low-lying regions. Italy, Spain, and southern France all had endemic malaria. Even parts of England were affected. The fens in eastern England were infamous for ray, a word that once meant any kind of shivering fever, but became a local shorthand for malaria. Monks, farmers, and fishermen all endured it. In literature, from the time, it appears almost as a character, something grim and familiar. The disease was part of the scenery. Meanwhile, in Africa and Asia, malaria shaped empire in different ways. The disease didn't respect power. It brought down armies and explorers alike. When Europeans began their so-called Age of Exploration, they quickly discovered that tropical conquest came with an invisible price. Ships could survive storms and cannons, but not always the mosquito. West Africa, in particular, became known to European sailors as the white man's grave. Mortality rates among unacclimated visitors were staggering. Coastal forts, established for trade, were often surrounded by swamps. Soldiers and merchants fell sick within weeks. The fevers were mysterious, pitiless, and all too common. This harsh reality did not stop imperial ambitions, but it shaped their logistics. European powers learned to rely on local intermediaries, people already immune or resistant to the disease. Malaria was a natural barrier to colonization. Long before political boundaries existed, it preserved certain regions from direct control while inviting exploitation from afar. And then came the discovery that would change everything, though it took a long, circuitous path to get there. The story starts not in Europe, but in South America, in the forests of the Andes, where the bark of a particular tree, the cinchona, was found to have remarkable effects on fever. Indigenous peoples of Peru and Bolivia had used it long before Europeans arrived. They noticed it reduced chills and restored strength. When Spanish missionaries learned of this remedy in the 1600s, they brought it back across the Atlantic. By the 17th century, powdered cinchona bark, often called Jesuits' bark or Peruvian bark, had become Europe's first real treatment for malaria. It was not a cure, but it worked better than anything else known. The active compound, later identified as quinine, disrupted the parasite's life cycle. At the time, no one understood why it worked. They just knew it did. It's easy to picture the scene. Dark apothecaries, wooden drawers labeled in Latin, physicians grinding the bitter bark into tonics. It became a staple of colonial medicine, a symbol of both faith and empire. In some corners, Protestants distrusted it simply because Jesuits had popularized it. Yet it spread anyway, because survival had a way of cutting through religious politics. With quinine, Europeans gained a fragile shield against malaria, and that changed the geography of empire. Suddenly, the tropical world was more accessible, not safer exactly, but manageable. Expeditions that would have been suicidal a century earlier could now proceed at least with heavy doses of bark powder. Colonies flourished in areas that had once seemed impossible to inhabit year-round. The British in India, the Dutch in Indonesia, the French in Indochina all relied on quinine as an unofficial member of their armies. It was mixed with water and sugar, creating the bitter tonic water we still drink today, often spiked with gin, because apparently empire was easier to handle after a few drinks. Of course, the parasite adapted. It always does. Malaria evolved resistance in some regions, and even with quinine, the disease remained widespread. For every colonial outpost that thrived, countless local communities still suffered. Malaria's role in empire was double-edged. It protected some regions from conquest and made others dependent on outside medicine. It was both obstacle and instrument. As the centuries turned, scientists began to unravel its mysteries. In the late 19th century, after thousands of years of speculation, researchers finally found the culprit under a microscope. The French army doctor, Alphonse Celavren, identified the parasite in human blood in 1880. His discovery was met with polite disbelief at first. The idea that tiny living organisms cause disease was still relatively new. But Laveran persisted, sketching what he saw through his eyepiece. Dark, wriggling shapes inside red blood cells. It was the first time humanity had looked malaria in the eye, so to speak. Not long after, the British physician Ronald Ross proved that mosquitoes carried the parasite. Working in India in the 1890s, he dissected mosquitoes that had fed on infected patients and traced the parasite's development inside their bodies. It was delicate, frustrating work, the kind that required both patience and a remarkable tolerance for insect bites. Ross's discovery confirmed what generations of people had suspected but never proven. Malaria was not about bad air at all. It was about blood, mosquitoes, and parasites. The miasma theory, after centuries of dominance, finally evaporated. This new understanding ushered in an era of public health campaigns. Colonial administrations launched mosquito control programs. Swamps were drained, breeding sites filled, screens installed, quinine distributed.
It was a mix of science and bureaucracy, optimism and imperialism. In some places, malaria rates did drop dramatically. In others, the results were uneven. The mosquitoes always seemed to find new puddles, new ways to persist. And yet, in this period of discovery, malaria remained deeply entangled with empire. It wasn't just a medical problem, it was political. Colonial powers used disease control as a justification for occupation, civilizing missions disguised as public health. The irony is that local populations often understood the rhythms of malaria better than their colonial rulers. They knew which months to avoid certain fields, which times of day brought the worst bites. But those lived insights rarely made it into official report.
As the 20th century dawned, the world stood on the edge of yet another transformation, one that would tie malaria even more closely to the map of empire. The story drifted from tropical colonies to laboratories, from military camps to mosquito-filled trenches. By the early 20th century, malaria had become both a symbol and a symptom of empire. It lingered wherever trade ships anchored too long, wherever colonial workers drained swamps or carved new canals. It was the quiet companion of globalization, uninvited but always present. In the eyes of European administrators, malaria was something to be conquered, not just medically, but symbolically. They wanted to show that science could tame the tropics the way gunpowder and bureaucracy had tamed nations. And so, the great public health experiments began. In the early 1900s, British colonial officials in India waged massive anti-malaria campaigns. They built drainage systems, distributed quinine rations, and mapped mosquito breeding sites with military precision. The tone of the reports was always the same: confident, orderly, slightly self-congratulatory. But malaria did not read reports. It didn't care about colonial pride. It simply adapted, as it always had. The British found that their campaigns worked best in isolated garrisons or hill stations, places where the population was small and controllable. In the broader countryside, the results were uneven. Peasants often refused quinine because it tasted awful. Some thought it was poison, and to be fair, it did taste like something scraped off the bottom of a rusty spoon. So malaria remained, sometimes quiet, sometimes roaring back after the officials moved on. In Africa, the story was even more tangled. When European powers carved up the continent during the late 19th century, they did not pay much attention to disease ecology. They simply drew lines across maps. But the mosquitoes didn't care about borders either. In West Africa, especially around the coast, Anopheles gambia thrived. It was an efficient and ruthless vector, perfectly suited to human settlements. Colonial outposts became laboratories of both science and tragedy. Missionaries, doctors, and administrators wrote endless letters about the fever. Some grew obsessed with sanitation. Others quietly accepted that malaria was simply part of life. A few, especially in the early decades, believed that Africans were somehow naturally immune, a convenient fiction that excused a lack of concern. In truth, while people born in malarial zones did build partial resistance, they still suffered and died in vast numbers. Immunity, in this case, meant survival at a cost, not invulnerability. Meanwhile, in Europe itself, malaria was still quietly at work. It had not vanished from the continent. Southern Italy, Greece, the Balkans, and even parts of Russia had endemic malaria well into the 20th century. Soldiers stationed near marshes, farmers tending rice fields, and fishermen living along deltas all carried the parasite. It was, for many, just another hardship of rural life. Only in the cooler north had it retreated, though not entirely. Even London, in the 19th century, recorded cases along the Thames. The city's industrial smoke may have helped drive away the mosquitoes, which is a grimly poetic trade-off. Less malaria, more soot in your lung. As the 20th century rolled forward, global events changed the dynamics again. Wars tend to magnify every human weakness, and malaria was no exception. During World War I, troops stationed in the Balkans and the Middle East fell ill in droves. Quinine supplies were limited, and mosquito control was nearly impossible in the chaos of war. Soldiers in muddy trenches battled not only enemies but fevers, chills, and hallucination. Then came World War II, and malaria once again proved itself a cunning strategist. The Pacific and North African theaters were especially plagued. Entire battalions were incapacitated without a single shot fired. In Burma and New Guinea, malaria sometimes claimed more soldiers than combat itself. Quinine supplies were again a problem, this time because the main sources of cinchona bark were in Dutch-controlled Indonesia, which had fallen to Japan. Desperation breeds invention. In response, scientists turned to chemistry. German researchers developed synthetic antimalarials like chloroquine and mepegrine, also known as atebrine. These drugs were more stable, mass-producible, and somewhat less dependent on the whims of empire, but they came with side effects: yellowed skin, nausea, nightmares. Soldiers hated taking them, and many simply refused. Commanders eventually had to treat compliance as a military order. Somewhere between the fever and the medicine, morale evaporated. After the war, the mood shifted. The world, exhausted and rebuilding, suddenly believed in science's power to fix things. Permanent penicillin had saved millions. Vaccines had transformed childhood survival, and the atomic age promised limitless progress, though that turned out to be a mixed blessing. In this atmosphere of optimism, the World Health Organization launched an ambitious plan in the 1950s, the global eradication of malaria. The campaign was vast, expensive, and at first, surprisingly successful. It combined aggressive mosquito control with widespread use of a new chemical marvel, DDT, sprayed on walls, bed nets, and breeding grounds. DDT killed mosquitoes efficiently and lingered long enough to break transmission cycles. Countries like the United States, Italy, and Greece declared themselves malaria-free within a few years. The success stories made headlines. Malaria seemed, for the first time in history, to be retreating, but the victory was not universal. In Africa and parts of Asia, the campaign faltered. The infrastructure needed steady funding. Stable governments, trained personnel was often missing. Spraying campaigns were inconsistent. Drugs ran out. Mosquitoes developed resistance, and so did the parasites. The effort, heroic on paper, was less so in practice. By the 1970s, the WHO quietly acknowledged defeat. Malaria had not been eradicated. It had merely moved back into its old haunts. Still, the story wasn't all disappointment. The eradication effort did succeed in reshaping public health. It built systems, trained workers, and inspired later campaigns against other diseases. And it proved once again that malaria was not just a biological issue. It was a political and economic one. Where wealth and stability existed, the disease could be driven out. Where poverty and instability persisted, it remained. Meanwhile, the map of malaria continued to tell the story of empire in slow motion. In the Americas, it was tied to slavery and colonization. The parasite had crossed the Atlantic along with both enslaved Africans and European settlers. In the southern United States, malaria thrived in the swamps and rice fields of the Carolinas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Plantation labor created the perfect habitat: standing water, heat, and human hosts. Even after the Civil War, malaria lingered in the rural South for another century. The Tennessee Valley Authority's dam projects in the 1930s helped reduce mosquito habitats, but not before generations had lived under the shadow of fevers. It's tempting, in hindsight, to see malaria as something ancient and distant, a relic of pre-modern life. But even today, it remains one of the most widespread infectious diseases in the world. Its grip has loosened, but not broken. Every few years, scientists announce new progress, new vaccines, new strategies, and yet the parasite keeps finding a way back, like a ghost of empire refusing to rest. Looking at a map of malaria today, you can still trace the outlines of colonial history. The regions most affected are often those once ruled, exploited, or reshaped by imperial powers. The disease thrives where infrastructure was built for extraction rather than health, where borders cut through ecosystems, and where inequality never really ended. Malaria may not recognize politics, but politics certainly helped it along. If there's any comfort to be found, it's that humans have learned to understand it better. We know what causes it, how it spreads, how to prevent it, bed nets, insecticides, better housing, and now vaccines. All these things have chipped away at its dominance. It's no longer the defining force it once was. But the story of malaria is still, in many ways, the story of us, our empires, our experiments, our mistakes, and our endurance. There's something quietly humbling about that. A creature so small, so ancient, managed to steer human destiny for millennia. It shaped trade routes, military campaigns, even city planning. It humbled emperors and spared no one. For all our progress, we still share the same biological vulnerability that linked us to the Romans, the Mughals, and the colonists. As the 20th century closed, malaria remained a paradox, curable but persistent, ancient but modern, simple in cause, yet complex in consequence. Scientists continued their work, sometimes with great breakthroughs, sometimes with quiet setbacks. In 1976, researchers identified the full life cycle of Plasmodium falciparum in the lab, finally illuminating what had eluded observation for centuries. A few decades later came the first genetically engineered mosquitoes, designed to resist infection. Progress drifted forward, uneven but real. And still, in the background, the story of malaria kept whispering through history. It was there when empires rose, when they fell, and when the world tried to outgrow them. It was the sound of night in the tropics, the hum behind the march of armies, the quiet fever that reminded humanity that not all enemies carry swords. Even as humanity entered the sleek, fluorescent-lit decades of the late 20th century, malaria lingered like an unfinished story. For those living in air-conditioned cities, the disease seemed distant, something that happened over there, in villages, by rivers, and jungles thick with humidity. But in reality, malaria was everywhere in the margin. It hovered at the edges of development, ready to return if vigilance faded for even a moment. Scientists had given it a name, mapped its life cycle, and pinned its image under countless microscopes, yet somehow it remained one step ahead. The mosquito, humble and persistent, continued its quiet campaign, and the parasite it carried, Plasmodium falciparum, most infamously, was a master of adaptation. For every drug humanity invented, malaria evolved a trick to dodge it. By the 1980s, chloroquine, once the wonder drug of post-war medicine, was losing its power. Resistance had emerged in Southeast Asia and Africa, spreading with alarming speed. The parasite's genetic flexibility was astounding. Each failed cure became a new lesson in humility. Scientists scrambled for alternatives, combinations, new compounds, anything that could hold the line. Some worked for a while, most didn't last. The result was a grim rhythm: hope, progress, relapse, repeat. In the background of these struggles, malaria continued to shape the economics of entire regions. Countries burdened by high infection rates saw slower development, weaker labor forces, and strained healthcare systems. Children missed school, adults missed work, and local economies limped along. The disease was both a cause and a symptom of poverty, each feeding the other in an endless loop. The World Health Organization began referring to it as a disease of poverty, though that phrasing, while accurate, perhaps understated its grip on history. Malaria had made poverty as much as it fed on it. Some of the worst outbreaks during this era occurred not in the wild frontiers of empire, but in the aftermath of its collapse. Post-colonial nations inherited fragile infrastructures, drainage systems abandoned, clinics underfunded, research networks dismantled. During civil wars or political upheavals, malaria roared back like an old creditor collecting debts. Refugee camps became breeding grounds, both for mosquitoes and despair. The fever didn't discriminate, but it thrived best where governments had stopped paying attention. Meanwhile, in the West, malaria was mostly remembered through nostalgia and science fiction. School children learned about it as something defeated, a medical footnote from the days of empire. The irony was thick. The countries that had once spread malaria through conquest were now the ones least touched by it, while their former colonies bore its ongoing weight. But human memory is short. By the 1990s, the disease began slipping from public consciousness, replaced by newer global fears, HIV, Ebola, and others. Funding waned. The research momentum of the mid-century era slowed, and yet malaria was quietly biding its time. The mosquitoes had not gone anywhere, after all. They merely waited in the warmth, their populations swelling with every rainy season. Then came the resurgence of interest, the rediscovery of an ancient cure in modern form. In China, scientists revisited old herbal texts, tracing remedies used during the Han Dynasty for fevers described suspiciously like malaria. From those dusty pages came Artemisia annua, the sweet wormwood plant. Its active compound, artemisinin, would become the next great weapon in humanity's long struggle. Discovered in the 1970s by the Chinese researcher Tu Youyou, artemisinin was remarkably effective. It worked fast, killed the parasite at multiple stages, and crucially, offered hope where other drugs had failed. Decades later, it became the foundation of combination therapies used worldwide. Tu Youyou eventually won the Nobel Prize for her work, though in her typically modest way, she credited ancient wisdom more than modern brilliance. It was a quiet reminder that sometimes solutions drift through history, forgotten until we're desperate enough to look back. Artemisinin gave malaria control a second wind. In the 2000s, new funding poured in. The Global Fund, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and countless NGOs joined forces with local governments. Bed nets treated with insecticide became standard in many regions. Vaccination research accelerated, progress followed, though unevenly. Death rates dropped dramatically in some countries, less so in others. The parasite remained stubbornly clever, and the mosquito, small as it was, continued to outmaneuver humans in subtle, relentless ways. Meanwhile, the landscapes that had once defined empire began to shift. Swamps became cities, jungles turned into farmland, and yet the conditions that favored malaria, heat, humidity, standing water, inequality, persisted. In some places, climate change began to redraw the map of infection. Warmer temperatures pushed mosquitoes into new altitudes and latitudes. The disease that had once defined the tropics began to test the edges of the temperate world again. It was almost poetic, in a grim sort of way. The planet changing just enough to remind us that old problems never really die. They just wait. Looking back, It's hard not to marvel at how malaria threaded itself through nearly every chapter of human civilization. It was there in the fevered fields of ancient Mesopotamia, the marshes of Rome, the plantations of the Americas, the trenches of war, the laboratories of empire. It humbled emperors and kings, missionaries and generals. It united humanity in suffering, even when humanity itself was too divided to note. And through it all, malaria shaped geography in subtle ways. The ancient Greeks built cities inland, away from swamps. The Romans founded colonies where they could drain marshes efficiently. Colonial administrators planned hill stations, little European bubbles perched above the fevered plains. Even today, city planners in endemic regions account for mosquito habitats when designing drainage or housing. Entire civilizations have been organized around avoiding a bite. But malaria's influence goes deeper than infrastructure. It shaped culture too. It appears in folklore, in metaphors, in art. The word fever itself carries a weight that transcends medicine. It's used for passion, for obsession, for longing. Even in literature, malaria became shorthand for decay or exoticism. European travelers writing about Africa or Asia often described the air as feverish, as though the land itself were alive with illness. It was a way to romanticize danger, to turn suffering into atmosphere, and yet, for the people who actually lived with it, malaria was rarely romantic. It was routine, banal, an inconvenience that could also kill you. Families in rural villages learn to recognize the cycle of chills and sweats as naturally as the phases of the moon. Mothers knew when a child's fever would break and when it might not. Healers prepared herbs, priests offered prayers, and life went on. That ordinariness, the quiet coexistence with danger, is one of the most haunting parts of malaria's history. It was never a single catastrophic event, like a plague sweeping through a city. It was a slow, cyclical rhythm that blended into daily life. It didn't wipe out populations overnight. It wore them down over generations. A child survived, then relapsed. An adult grew weak, then died during the next rainy season. Fields went untended, economies faltered, empires stumbled, all of it too gradual to make headlines, yet powerful enough to bend the trajectory of civilizations. There's something almost hypnotic about that idea. The slow burn of a disease that never quite leaves, that hums beneath the surface of history like background noise. The Romans heard it in the buzzing of their marshes. The Victorians heard it in the whine of mosquitoes through canvas tents. And even now, in the soft light of an electric lamp, a person somewhere is swatting at that same sound, feeling the same bite, fighting the same fever. When you think of history as a chain of great men and big events, malaria seems like a footnote. But when you zoom out, it looks more like a thread, subtle, persistent, tying together the fates of empires, explorers, and ordinary people alike. It reminds us that power, in all its pomp and ceremony, is fragile when nature decides otherwise. A single mosquito can humble an army, a monarch, or an entire civilization. And perhaps that's why malaria remains such a fitting metaphor for empire itself. Beautiful from a distance, deadly up close, and never quite conquered, no matter how many times we declare victory. In the quiet half-century that followed the grand eradication attempts of the 1950s and 60s, malaria settled into a kind of uneasy truce with humanity. Not gone, not even dormant, just contained for now. The fever still burned in the lowlands of Africa, the jungles of Southeast Asia, and the river deltas of South America. that in many other places it had faded to memory. A story told by grandparents who remembered the shivers and the quinine and the faint smell of kerosene from mosquito coils. It's easy to imagine how the memory softened with time. In Italy, people began speaking of malaria the way one might speak of a terrible winter long past. Something grim but almost nostalgic. By the late 20th century, the Roman Campagna, once a graveyard of fever, had been transformed by agriculture and modern drainage. Tourists wandered the same landscapes that had terrified travelers for centuries, now blissfully unaware that each field had once buzzed with disease. In the American South, too, malaria had slipped into folklore. The ague was something your great-grandfather might have had before the dam projects came. The Tennessee Valley Authority in the 1930s and 40s had not only electrified the region, but also reshaped its hydrology, cutting down on mosquito habitats. By the 1950s, the Centers for Disease Control, founded incidentally as the Office of Malaria Control in War Areas, declared the disease eradicated from the continental United States. Few people noticed the symbolism in that bureaucratic victory. It was quiet, bureaucratic, and strangely appropriate for an enemy that had always preferred to work in whispers. Elsewhere, though, malaria remained an everyday reality. In sub-Saharan Africa, entire generations grew up under its shadow. It was often described as normal, an unavoidable part of childhood. The parasite's grip on the continent was immense. It thrived in the climate, the ecology, and the poverty left behind by colonial systems that had extracted wealth but neglected infrastructure. In many regions, people still lived close to stagnant water because there was nowhere else to go. It wasn't that the world had forgotten Africa's malaria problem. It was more that it had learned to look away, distracted by other crises. In the 1980s and 90s, HIV/AIDS drew the headlines and funding. Malaria was harder to dramatize. It didn't have the shock value of a new epidemic. It was too old, too familiar. You couldn't make people fear something they thought of as permanent. But malaria had one advantage over nearly every other disease in human history. It was spectacularly predictable. The mosquitoes emerged with the rains, bit at night, laid eggs in puddles and ditches, and repeated the cycle endlessly. It was a pattern you could set your calendar by. The problem was not knowledge, it was will. Still, progress flickered on the horizon. The late 1990s brought new tools, renewed funding, and a wave of optimism. Public health campaigns distributed millions of insecticide-treated bed nets. Simple, low-cost, and surprisingly elegant, the nets became symbols of grassroots success. They didn't require electricity or complex logistics or even literacy, just consistency. Children slept beneath them, and malaria cases began to fall. It was proof, once again, that sometimes the simplest technologies make the biggest difference. And then there was the promise of vaccines, a dream nearly as old as modern medicine itself. For decades, scientists had tried and failed to produce one. The parasite was too complex, its life cycle too slippery. It was not a virus or a bacterium. It was a shapeshifter, hiding inside red blood cells, switching proteins like masks. But in the 21st century, that dream finally came closer to reality. After decades of trial, the RTS vaccine was developed, showing partial protection in children. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was something for a disease that had haunted humanity for 10,000 years. Something was extraordinary progress. All the while, malaria's story continued to intersect with the old geography of empire. Take India, for instance. Once the jewel in the British crown, it had been both laboratory and battleground for malaria research. After independence, India launched its own eradication campaign, achieving remarkable reductions in the 1950s and 60s, before a resurgence in the 1970s. By the 2000s, malaria was again in retreat thanks to renewed domestic programs, but it was a recurring pattern, a reminder that even freedom from empire didn't mean freedom from its ecological inheritance. In Southeast Asia, the story was much the same. Colonial rubber plantations had reshaped the landscape, creating perfect mosquito habitats. Later, wars added to the problem. During the Vietnam War, American troops learned firsthand what French soldiers had learned a generation earlier. The jungle was not just an enemy's hiding place, but a breeding ground for malaria. At one point, nearly half the US troops in certain regions were infected. Military doctors deployed antimalarials like atabrine and chloroquine, but resistance and side effects plagued their efforts. The war ended, the soldiers went home, and the mosquitoes stayed. When peace came, malaria quietly reclaimed its old territory. For the people who lived there, nothing had changed. The fever was still as old as the rain. If malaria has a kind of tragic poetry, it's in this endless recurrence, the way it mirrors human history's own patterns. Every generation believes it can conquer it, and every generation is reminded that victory is temporary. There's something oddly comforting in that. If you squint hard enough, the idea that nature keeps us humble. Even today, global maps of malaria look strangely like old colonial charts. Lines drawn around the equator, dense clusters where empire once thrived and then fell. The disease still follows trade routes, migration paths, and the fault lines of inequality. The old names are gone, British West Africa, the Dutch East Indies, but the patterns remain. The ghost of empire hums beneath the buzz of a mosquito's wings. Of course, the modern world has new ways of talking about it. Malaria is now a matter of global health, sustainable development goals, and vector management. It's all very professional, very sterile. The vocabulary has changed, but the people most affected haven't. In rural clinics, parents still bring feverish children wrapped in thin blankets. Nurses still test blood smears under flickering bulbs. Bed nets still hang from tin roofs, their edges tucked neatly under straw mats. It's the same story, just with newer acronyms. There's a kind of irony in how we narrate progress. In the rich world, we tend to treat malaria as a solved problem, a triumph of science. But in much of the world, it's simply Tuesday. The fever comes, the fever goes, life continues. The numbers, millions of cases per year, blur into abstraction, too large to feel. Only on the ground does the disease retain its full weight. The heat, the shivering, the exhaustion, the quiet endurance. And yet, humanity keeps moving forward. The 21st century has brought tools that earlier generations could only dream of. Drones map breeding sites. Genetic engineering creates mosquitoes that can't carry parasites. Satellite data predicts outbreaks before they happen. There's something almost surreal about using space technology to fight an ancient swamp disease, but that's where we are. Still, one can't help but feel that the struggle with malaria isn't really about medicine. It's about memory. The wealthier parts of the world forgot what it felt like to live with the fever, so they stopped caring. The poorer parts remember too well, but lack the means to escape it. Between those two realities lies a gap wider than any ocean. If history has taught anything about malaria, it's that forgetting is dangerous. Every time the world declares victory, the parasite waits. Every time the maps turn green, the mosquitoes regroup. The disease doesn't need to evolve quickly. It just needs patience. And patience, as history shows, is something it has in abundance. Even so, the story isn't hopeless. Progress is slower now, quieter, less headline-worthy, but it's still progress. Fewer children die each year. More communities live free of the fever's rhythm. Science continues to chip away at the parasite's mysteries. Humanity, for all its arrogance and mistakes, refuses to give up the fight. Perhaps that's what defines this strange relationship between malaria and empire, between humans and nature, persistence on both sides. The mosquito endures, and so do we, both small, both stubborn, both unwilling to leave the stage. And so the story drifts on into another century. The modern world has a way of pretending that the past is safely sealed away, its diseases conquered, its empires archived. Yet malaria, in its quiet, cyclical persistence, continues to blur those boundaries. It doesn't belong to the past or the present exactly. It drifts between them like humidity in the air. You can ignore it if you live far enough away, but the moment you step into the wrong climate, the past comes humming right back to meet you. In this century, scientists sometimes describe malaria as a solved problem that refuses to stay solved. They say it with the weary tone of people who have seen their data ruined by reality too many times. You can have the perfect model, the perfect drug, the perfect control program, and then one rainy season, it all falls apart. A civil war, a funding cut, a change in rainfall patterns. Anything can reset decades progress. The parasite doesn't even need malice to win. It just needs time. Meanwhile, the story of malaria continues to mirror human behavior in oddly poetic ways. Consider the global supply chain for antimalarial drugs. Artemisinin, that miracle compound rediscovered from ancient Chinese medicine, still depends largely on smallholder farmers growing wormwood in China, Vietnam, and East Africa. They harvest it, process it, and sell it to pharmaceutical companies that refine it into pills shipped back to the very regions where the plant grew. The whole cycle feels like something out of a fable, an empire of medicine, running on the same trade routes that once carried spices and silk, now transporting another kind of precious powder. And yet, for all this interconnectedness, malaria remains a deeply local experience. It's not a single global crisis, but millions of personal ones. Children waking in the night, shivering under nets, parents waiting for clinics to open. In some places, people have developed an almost stoic rhythm with it. The fever is expected, endured, and if they're lucky, survived. In others, where interventions have taken hold, it has started to recede, not with drama or fanfare, but like a long drought ending quietly with rain. When you trace malaria's path through history, it's tempting to think of it as a force of nature, something outside of human control. But that's only half true. Humans created the perfect conditions for it. Our settlements, our agriculture, our wars. We dug canals and built rice paddies, drained wetlands here, and flooded valleys there. Every change we made to the landscape invited mosquitoes to join us. Empires spread, not just trade and language, but also the ecosystems that made malaria thrive. The fever was in many ways the price of civilization. Take, for example, the story of African railroads in the early 20th century. Colonial governments built them to move goods, rubber, coffee, copper, out of the interior, but the rail lines cut through swamps, creating stagnant pools along their embankments. Workers died in droves. Engineers wrote home about the dreadful fever as if it were a supernatural force. They didn't realize that their own construction projects had given the mosquitoes everything they needed. Progress, in this case, meant more breeding grounds. Even after independence, the pattern continued. New nations built dams to generate electricity and irrigate crops. The Aswan High Dam in Egypt, completed in the 1960s, was hailed as a triumph of modern engineering. It tamed the Nile, but it also created still water along its edges, a paradise for mosquitoes. Malaria, once nearly eradicated in parts of Egypt, began to creep back. It was as if the ghosts of empire had returned, disguised as infrastructure. The same paradox played out across Asia. In Sri Lanka, then called Ceylon, the British had managed to control malaria through extensive drainage and quinine programs. After independence, those systems slowly eroded. In 1934, before the final years of British rule, an epidemic had already foreshadowed the danger. More than 5 million people infected, 80,000 dead, all within months. It was a brutal reminder that control depended not just on medicine, but on maintenance. The mosquitoes didn't care who governed the island. They only cared about the puddles. Even in the Americas, malaria's presence was stubborn. Brazil, with its vast rivers and humid forests, fought repeated battles against it. During the construction of Brasilia in the 1950s, thousands of workers fell ill. The city was supposed to represent the nation's modern future, yet its birth was haunted by the same ancient fever that had stalked the Amazon for millennia. The insect nets fluttered in the workers' camps, thin and fragile symbols of humanity's long, weary stalemate with nature. If malaria's persistence feels frustrating, it's because it reveals something uncomfortable about progress. For centuries, people believed that civilization meant rising above nature, draining the swamps, paving the roads, building the walls. But malaria has always been the quiet rebuttal to that idea. It doesn't attack from outside. It seeps in through the cracks. It thrives on the spaces between our ambitions, the neglected ditch, the broken pipe, the uncollected rain. It's not so much an invader as a mirror, showing us the cost of our own carelessness. In a strange way, malaria has also influenced how we think about the tropics themselves. For much of Western history, tropical was synonymous with unhealthy. The association wasn't just medical, it was cultural. Tropical regions were depicted as beautiful, but dangerous, alluring, but deadly. The fever became a metaphor for the people, and the land, unpredictable, untamable, somehow both fascinating and feared. This language justified a great deal of colonial paternalism. The empire, after all, told itself it was bringing health and order to diseased lands, even while it profited from the same conditions that sustained the disease. It's difficult in hindsight not to notice the irony. The very powers that claimed to civilize the tropics were also the ones that introduced vast monocultures, sugar, coffee, cotton, that required standing water and human labor. Those plantations became ideal breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Malaria spread along with commerce. If one were to redraw the map of empire, not by its flags, but by its fevers, it would look remarkably familiar. And yet, for all that, malaria never belonged to the colonizers. It belonged to the people who endured it, generation after generation, long before and long after empire. Their survival shaped genetics, medicine, and even language. Across Africa and Asia, local remedies emerged, infusions of herbs, tree barks, roots that often mirrored the pharmacology of quinine. or artemisinin, folk wisdom dismissed by outsiders, often held the same practical truth as laboratory science. Humanity's relationship with malaria was never just scientific. It was intimate, domestic, passed from mother to child, like a grim inheritance. Today, when people talk about the last mile in malaria eradication, they're usually referring to logistics, the challenge of reaching remote villages or maintaining funding. But perhaps the phrase has another meaning. The last mile isn't just physical, it's historical. It's the long, slow journey from indifference to memory, from empire's shadow to genuine equality. Eradicating malaria means more than killing a parasite. It means dismantling the systems that let it flourish in the first place. In that sense, the story of malaria is still being written. It's a story about medicine, yes, but also about memory, power, and humility. Every mosquito bite is a small reminder that history isn't gone. It's airborne, waiting, humming in the dark. And so, as the world marches deeper into the 21st century, malaria remains both ancient and modern, a whisper from the past carried on the wings of something too small to see, too familiar to fear, too old to die. By now, malaria feels like a story that should have ended long ago. Humanity invented airplanes, smartphones, and space stations. Surely a parasite shouldn't still be winning. Yet, here it is, still humming along in the background, still shaping lives in ways too quiet for headlines. For all our technology, malaria remains the persistent reminder that we share the planet with creatures far older, far more patient, and far less impressed by us than we'd like to think. In 2020, the World Health Organization reported hundreds of millions of infections worldwide. Most cases were in sub-Saharan Africa, where the Anopheles gambia mosquito continues to reign supreme. That particular species is extraordinarily efficient. It prefers human blood, breeds close to human settlements, and bites mostly at night, when people are asleep. It has evolved alongside us, thriving on our warmth and our water. You could almost admire it, if it weren't such a nuisance. The persistence of malaria in Africa isn't just a matter of biology, it's geography, economics, and history, all tangled together. The regions most affected are the same ones carved up during the colonial era, where borders ignored rivers and ecosystems, where the infrastructure served ports and plantations, but not people. Those systems of neglect didn't vanish with independence. They lingered in the gaps between cities and countryside, between hospitals and homes. Malaria filled those gaps with the same quiet efficiency it always had. But there's something remarkable too in the way communities have adapted. In parts of Ghana and Tanzania, school children can recite mosquito life cycles, the way others recite multiplication tables. Local volunteers, sometimes called mosquito scouts, walk from house to house, checking nets and explaining prevention methods. In villages where medicine is scarce, people still share whatever they have. It's not victory, exactly, but it's resilience. Humanity, it seems, has learned to coexist with the parasite in ways that are both tragic and strangely graceful. Meanwhile, scientists continue to look for the elusive cure-all. Vaccines have improved, drugs have been refined, and gene editing technologies now offer possibilities that border on science fiction. One approach involves releasing genetically modified mosquitoes that can't carry plasmodium at all. In theory, these modified insects would outbreed their wild counterparts, eventually making the disease impossible to transmit. It's elegant in principle, mildly terrifying in practice. After all, the last time humans thought they could control an entire ecosystem, the ecosystem disagreed, Still, the trials go on because the alternative is to let the old cycle continue indefinitely. Elsewhere, researchers explore the idea of sterile insect techniques. Mosquitoes bred to be infertile and released en masse to collapse the population. It's less about eradication than balance. The goal isn't to wipe mosquitoes off the face of the earth, tempting though that sounds. It's to push them back just far enough that malaria can't find a foothold. Progress is slow, cautious, sometimes bureaucratic, but it's there. Each small gain feels monumental when measured against 10,000 years of history. The story of malaria is, in some ways, a parable about human overconfidence. Every time we think we've cornered it, the disease reminds us that biology isn't a puzzle to be solved, but a negotiation to be maintained. We invent a new drug, the parasite mutates. We drain a swamp, a new puddle appears. We celebrate a century without local cases, and then a traveler brings it back. The pattern repeats like a fever cycle, hope rising, breaking, subsiding. And yet, humanity keeps trying, which might be the most interesting part. The struggle against malaria has produced some of the most enduring examples of international cooperation. During the Cold War, when almost everything else was divided by ideology, the World Health Organization's malaria programs brought together scientists from both sides of the Iron Curtain, in a world that couldn't agree on much. Everyone could at least agree that mosquitoes were awful. It's easy to see why malaria makes such a good symbol for empire and its aftermath. Empires thrive on control, territorial, economic, and symbolic. Malaria resists control by its very nature. It laughs in its microscopic way at borders and bureaucracies. It cannot be conquered in the conventional sense. It can only be managed, and that infuriated generations of rulers who believed the world could be ordered from the top down. From the Roman emperors who drained swamps to the Victorians who sprayed DDT, the story has always been the same, a grand plan followed by a quiet relapse. But if you listen closely, there's a certain peace in that rhythm. It's the sound of continuity. The same hum that annoyed Roman farmers buzzed around colonial explorers, and still floats through humid nights today. History doesn't always move forward in straight lines. Sometimes it loops softly, endlessly. Somewhere, even now, a mosquito lands on a sleeping arm in the same way it did in the days of Augustus or Akbar. The parasite enters the bloodstream, slips into the liver, hides, multiplies, emerges, and repeats. It's a process older than the pyramids, older than language. It doesn't care about progress, or politics, or pride. It just is. And maybe that's why malaria continues to fascinate historians. It's both villain and mirror. It shows us the limits of power, the fragility of certainty, the arrogance of assuming we can bend nature entirely to our will. Every empire has its hubris, and malaria has outlived them all. The disease also reveals something about human compassion. For every conqueror who dismissed it, there were countless doctors, nurses, and volunteers who fought it quietly, without glory or conquest. They drained swamps, delivered bed nets, crushed pills into spoons for feverish children. Their work rarely makes it into history books, yet they form the real counterpoint to the parasite's endurance, persistence, empathy, and an unshakable refusal to give up. Perhaps that's how the story ends, not with eradication, but with balance. Maybe malaria will never disappear entirely. Maybe the best we can do is shrink its territory, year by year, until it becomes what it once was, a background hum, a reminder of humility. The empire of the mosquito may never fall completely, but neither will the quiet determination of those who resist it. In the end, The map of Malaria is also a map of human nature. Ambitious, stubborn, resilient, flawed. It shows where we've been and what we've learned or failed to learn. It tells the story of our relationship with the environment, with power, with one another. Every shaded zone on that map marks not just infection, but history of conquest and resistance, arrogance and endurance, loss and renewal. And when you step back far enough, when you let your eyes drift over those faint lines and colors, it looks almost like a heartbeat, the pulse of civilization itself, faint but steady, echoing through time.